Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. Presently, and our final presenter this morning is Dave Gordon. Dave Gordon and I used to talk about blue box waste in a room that had, there was more people on the dais than there were in the conference hall. But now, over the last decade, the blue box transition has become an interesting and an important topic for municipalities. And Dave Gordon has been the chief architect of wrangling all of the municipalities. And Craig, as I talked about earlier, Craig Bartlett played a role, but the fact is that David was the individual that stick handled us to where we are today. He had help, no doubt, from great people, from municipal people from across the province, but Dave was able to wrangle everybody and get us through. So we wouldn't be where we are today, definitely, without Dave Gordon. So I'm glad he was able to join us this morning. And I will now open up his PowerPoint presentation, and so we can get going from his presentation.
Thanks very much, Mac, and thank you for that introduction. I think similar to what you heard from Craig, Mac was a big part of and continues to be a big part of trying to move these files forward with this continued push to get to full producer responsibility for a lot of the reasons you heard Craig and Usman talk about in their presentation. So I'm pleased for the opportunity today, and thanks very much for the invitation, Mac, to chat with your members today. I'm going to focus a little bit more just on the regulation itself and some of the pieces that are involved with it. You've heard two great presentations from two of the pros who will be in the market, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how there's what are some of the key elements of the regulation, the timeline that we've had to get here, and things like that, as well as some of those decisions your councils are going to have to make about your blue box program if you have an existing one as you move forward through the transition. Just this disclaimer is just to let you know that this isn't legal advice. We've done an interpretation of some of the key elements of the regulation, and certainly this sort of perspective is coming to you from AMO, but each local council is going to have to make their own decisions on how to proceed with this. We're here to provide a bit of advice and a bit of guidance where it's helpful, but certainly you'll want to make your own decisions. We do recommend consulting with your own legal counsel on some of the particulars in the regulation. You can take a look at that. And there are going to be areas that require some interpretation from RIPRA and from perhaps the ministry. So we've got a long list of sort of running questions that we've got from your staff and from other stakeholders across the province that we'll be getting clarifications on. If I can get the next slide, please, Mike. So we'll go through the timeline of what it took to sort of get here, and then what the future looks like. You've seen a bit of that in both Craig and Shane and Usman's presentation. Bit of an overview of the new reg. Some work going on by the Continuous Improvement Fund that probably many of your staff are involved in to look at some of the decisions that are going to have to be made around transition. And then I'll go through some of the decisions that I think you as and your councils are going to face in the next, this transition happens over, 3 years, starting in July of 2023, ending at the end of 25. It's going to basically span 3 different terms of council. So we'll walk through that a little bit. And get the next slide, please, Mike. So it has been a long road to get here. I initially started in 2015 on a secondment with AMO that was supposed to be a year and get this done and be on with it. Failed miserably at that, as you can see, and it's taken quite a while. This interest from municipalities has been a long-standing one. Obviously, municipalities are a big player in the waste diversion space, but there has been a long push by municipalities to move to full producer responsibility. Again, for many of the reasons that Craig and Usman and Shane have talked about, is to, really the key decision maker in all this is producers, the ones who make the products and packaging. They're the ones who have the ability to actually influence the design, the materials that are chosen, how they can be recycled, look to incorporate recycled content, And really, they're the ones who need to be driving the system and the decisions behind it. I think municipalities, as you've heard from them, could have a role to play in this as service providers, but there needs to be full control of the system attributed to producers for both the financing and the operation, and that's what we're getting to. In 2017, we tried a process with Stewardship Ontario and with other stakeholders to look at an amended Blue Box program plan. It was a good process. I think a lot was learned by all stakeholders through that, but ultimately it was not successful. A new government came into place, and we then saw them appoint a mediator, a special advisor, David Lindsay, who organized and held a mediation process between producers and municipalities that was successful and got us into some consultation on what a new Blue Box regulation could look like to make this move to full producer responsibility for the system. We had a draft reg come out for a consultation in the fall of 2020. And then just recently, June 3rd, we had a final regulation posted. So quite a bit of time to get here, but I think a lot of good lessons learned. It is complex, and shifting this responsibility from municipalities who are sort of designing and operating the system with some funding from stewards to now moving it to full producer responsibility. It's going to take some time and some disentanglement to get there, but I think it ultimately is going to be the best path for the system and for trying to actually get some of these results around, better products and packages, better recyclability, more sustainability, and more of a circular economy. Next slide, Matt, please. So there still is this sort of long road ahead, as I mentioned, to get through the transition. So 2021, this year we'll see registration for eligible communities, producers, and pros. 2022, Usman talked a little bit about some of these terms, but there is submission of rules on how producers and pros will work to establish the common collection system and what that'll look like. The allocation table, I'm probably dumbing this down too much, but in my view, it's really ends up with a listing that the ministry and RIPRA have that allocates all the communities across the province and all the different sources and puts down who's responsible for providing the service in those jurisdictions, so that there's this full sort of comprehensive list that that folks know who actually is responsible for what. In July to the end of 2025, we've got the transition of communities. We'll talk a bit about that. Craig showed the sort of schedule and the map of what transition looks like in each of the years. You definitely want to confirm when you're going and make sure that that works for you. Once that transition is completed, we'll see a shift to new eligible sources, standardized materials, and new targets. And then we have a ramp up in the targets coming into effect in 2030. Next slide, please, Mac. So this Blue Box new regulation. So it sees the establishment of a province-wide common collection system that will transition all the current municipal programs and also expand servicing to some new eligible sources. So all communities, regardless of size, except in the far north, will have a program post-transition. We know that, there's probably a number of you on this call that don't have programs. Mac and I certainly heard a lot about that at the different northern caucuses and Roma from rural folks who don't have programs. So that's going to be addressed, which is great. It covers all residential dwelling types, all schools, all publicly run retirement homes and long-term care facilities and nonprofit homes, as well as adding some more public spaces. It's got an enhanced and a standardized list of materials that will need to be collected and recycled. It's got high progressive enforceable targets. You heard Usman talk to that. So, targets are also being measured at the end of the recycling process, not just based on what's collected, which will help drive up the amount of material that can actually be reincorporated back into the economy. And there's this timeline for transition that'll help give municipalities, service providers, and producers some certainty in how to best manage the transition and how to plan for it. So, there's a lot of good pieces here, I think, that that's sort of set up for what's a good regulation. If I can get the next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. We have completed a number of webinars and workshops for your staff across the province, both while the regulation was in draft and since it's been finalized, to walk through some of these key elements and some of the implications. We've had lots of great questions come back from folks across the province. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got this sort of running list to get some interpretation from both RIPR and perhaps the ministry. So that's underway, and we'll certainly be providing that feedback back to you and back to your staff as we get it. If anyone is interested in the details, I'm happy to share it with you. We've got some decks that walk through each of these different components and describe them, and can share that with you. But yeah, it's generally the previous slide. I've shown what I think are some of the bigger changes and the benefits of the regulation over the current environment we're in, and this is some of the details. So I think, key takeaways for municipalities with the regulation, it's sort of a top line will be it ultimately is going to save your taxpayers about $156 million annually. That number, I would say, is going up. The cost to manage the system, it has been increasing. Your municipalities, though, you're going to have a big role in ensuring the transition is successful and seamless to your residents and in your communities. And I know I've certainly heard from elected officials across the province that that's job number one, is to make sure the system continues to work, and residents should only see benefits and improvements as we make this transition. And, although the responsibility is shifting to producers, your staff and your councils are going to have a big part to play in making sure that transition's successful. You're also at your council table is going to have a number of critical decisions to make about disentangling from your current contracts and obligations to provide blue box services as it shifts to producers, what to do with your assets and your human resources associated with blue box, your interest in trying to secure a commercial agreement with producers or a pro to provide blue box services on their behalf, and ensuring good performance of the system in your community, and making sure that targets and things like that are met within your neck of the woods as well as on sort of the provincial average, and make sure that it's working well in your community. Next slide, please, Meg. So I did want to talk a bit about the Continuous Improvement Fund. This is a fund where over the years, a certain portion of the steward obligation payment has been allocated to this fund, works on behalf of both municipalities and stewards. It's got sort of joint governance between those groups, but the focus has been on how to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the system. Jeff Rathbone and Carrie Nash are the key staffers there, and I've included their emails at the bottom of this slide. And them along with the Municipal 3Rs collaborative group that I've been working with, that Mac mentioned earlier. We've got a lot of projects underway to help municipalities with transition. They are working with a large number of volunteer municipalities, from volunteer staff for municipalities and with First Nation communities across the province to help prepare communities for transition. You can see here a number of projects that are underway. So contracts, what does fair compensation look like, communications and change management, post-collection, so both transfer and processing, as well as data monitoring and reporting. So I would suggest if some of these areas and some of this transition is a concern for you, to get involved or have your staff get involved in some of these projects. It's a lot that needs to be done to sort of get through this transition, and certainly there's good resources here that I think you can be involved with and take advantage of. CIF is committed to sharing this information and the results of this work across all municipalities and First Nations communities in the province who want to take advantage of it. They'll be hosting webinars and other types of outreach to sort of communicate this. But a lot of good things on the technical side happening here to help your communities prepare for transition. Next slide, please, Mac. So in terms of decisions that you'll need to make as a council, these are, I think some of the bigger things that you want to start, it's a bit of, trying to look a bit into the future in terms of what these decisions look like and helping you to get ready for them and how you might make those for your community. So next slide, please. So I can't take credit for this slide. I sort of plagiarized this from Francis Villieu. Some of you might know him. He's presented a number of times at different AMO and Roma meetings about the Blue Box. He works at the Blue Water Recycling Association, but I think it's a good summary of the decisions that different municipal councils are going to have to make through the transition and into post-transition. So right now, things that you need to be looking at and considering is there's a number of registration and pre-transition reports that need to be submitted to RIPRA by each municipality. The CIF project, the transition projects that I showed on that earlier slide, they have a data and reporting group and specific project that's working on some of this with RIPRA and municipalities. So there is information there on how to do it, and there will be webinars and guidance coming from RIPRA on this, but it is something you should be looking at. Your staff should be working on. It's basically identifying who's going to be eligible to be serviced during the transition and post-transition to ensure both RIPRA and the ministry have an accurate picture, and that can be conveyed to producers so they know who are the eligible sources that are eligible to receive services so that they can plan how they're going to execute that. So it's a critical piece, and it's important to get it right so that producers know exactly who to service, and ultimately to make sure that your residents and other eligible sources get and continue to get services, or those who are getting new services get properly added. You should also be looking at your transition date and confirming that. There's a schedule that's appended to the regulation that shows when each municipality is going. It's listed at the lower tier level. We know that some municipalities provide services through the upper tier. There's an ability for upper tiers to do the reporting with permission from the lower tiers on their behalf. But take a look at that transition schedule and see how it works for you, and make sure that it's got the dates I really think there's not a lot of changes that are going to happen to those dates. So you need to check those dates against what your current commitments are and how you're going to manage through that. I think, the next piece is around some of these decisions that you need to make about service provision. So you've heard both GFL and Usman and Shane talk about interest in working with municipalities as service providers, and certainly I think there is an interest to take on and utilize the expertise that municipalities have in operating these systems that you've done for over 2 decades. So I think though you need to look at, do you want to compete for collection, transfer, and processing services and work with pros to perhaps secure some of those contracts? You would look to negotiate a mutually agreed upon service contract with the producers and the pros. And to do that, you really need to understand your costs and the costs you'll incur to meet the conditions of producers in the new system. As we've talked about, there's likely different from what you have now in terms of the materials that are collected, but it's going to get into some of the technical details as well around, contamination rates that are tolerable, compaction rates, distance to transfer stations, where's the material going to be unloaded, customer service, complaint resolution, how much of that are you taking on, what's the compensation for it, and how will you deal with those things. So you are really going to want to understand your costs. You're going to understand what it costs you to provide those services, and then you're going to want to compare that against what producers are offering to see if there's value there for you or not. Again, A number of these elements are being worked on in this CIF transition project through the different subcommittees. So there's good advice and information there to help your communities work through doing your costing yourself to understand what it looks like. Another big decision is going to be how you will deal with non-eligible sources. So certain sources that you may be collecting from now, so things like business improvement areas, municipal buildings and facilities like arenas, libraries, community centers, they're not included in the regulation. So I think it's important to note that they weren't included in the current legislation either, in the current Blue Box program plan. But because municipalities are really driving and delivering the service, some of you may be collecting from those sources, but just deducting those tonnages and those costs from your data calls. So you're not getting funding for doing that, the 50% from the steward community and through Stewardship Ontario, but you may be providing those services. So you could offer the service, but the costs were ineligible. But now this responsibility for the system shifting to producers, and you may not be providing that service. So do you want to continue to provide Blue Box services to those sources that aren't covered in this legislation? If you decide yes, that is something you want to continue to do, you're going to have to figure out how to complete it. I know a number of the service providers are looking at this and are coming up with options. So that's certainly a route you can look at. In other jurisdictions, if you're not providing the service, then sometimes the pros have provided those collection services and would do that at a fee that you would pay as the municipality to have those sources collected. You can look at if you're going to be providing those services, you can perhaps continue to collect from there, but deduct those costs from what the producer, the pro, would be providing as compensation to you. You'll need to, look at the methodology on how you're going to do that and have that covered in your commercial agreement, I think, so everyone's clear and that's transparent to both parties. If you're not going to provide services to producer and pros, you're going to have to determine how to provide the service and where that material will be processed. So I think you want to start thinking about that sooner than later on how you're going to deal with that element. In terms of looking down the road a bit, both through the transition and then post-transition, there are some future issues and decisions that are going to have to be made. The schedule of collection is one thing that's highlighted here around a frequency change. In the regulation, the minimum standard producers need to meet is an every other week collection. Some folks are already on that. Some folks have weekly collection. We're not sure exactly where producers will generally go on that, and if that is going to be harmonized across the province or if it'll be different in certain areas, but something to consider. This new standardized list of materials, that can be, it's probably likely an increase for most communities in terms of the materials that are accepted, but that's something that's going to have to be considered. Is there going to be some standardization around the method of collection? So some of you may have single stream systems right now where all the papers and containers and fibers are mixed in one container. Some of you may have two stream systems with paper and fibers in one box or bin and containers in the other. Those are going to be things that may change as well as the method of collection. Is it going to be in blue boxes? Is it going to be in carts that can be collected more with automation or bags? How will producers want to do it and how will they standardize it? So that is a decision they get to make. I'm sure they'll want your thoughts on it. They'll want to, I think generally at the David Lindsay table, the agreements were let's try and make the best use of the assets that are out there and get through the life of those. But I think there will be a trend towards shifting on what producers see as the most optimal system going forward. Another thing to consider is, municipal boundaries don't matter anymore. So will there be a combining of municipalities for blue boxes to try and lump certain communities together to try and grow economies of scale? That's certainly an option that producers and pros may pursue. I think there's limits on collection because you really, you know, at the end of the day, the truck has to get back to a yard or a tipping point where it can drop materials and then get back to the route it's servicing. So it's not like trucks can travel hundreds of miles to do collections, but, you know, there are some smaller collection contracts out there that may be looked at for some consolidation. Will that impact your ability to provide services or not? Is something you want to think about. If you think there's economies of scale, do you look at, you know, adjoining municipalities or combining those? And certainly I think you want to have those discussions with pros and with producers to understand where their thinking is and what they're looking at as well. But just it is something to consider is, you know, there could be some changes around, you know, with this elimination of sort of municipal borders that you may see some consolidation in some areas of the province. And if I can get the next slide, Mac. Put Mac to sleep. There it is. So Craig showed this earlier. This is the sort of transition schedule. It's colored by year. This is information that's available with the posting on the ERO with the new regulation, and there is a schedule appended in there. So, you know, this shows a bit of what's changed in terms of the balance of it, but it is it's not an apples to apples comparison because there's, it's now done at the lower tier. So there's more communities listed than what there was previously when it was done at sort of that regional level, or it was basically done how the provincial data call was done previously. So you really want to take a look at this and confirm your date. There has been an attempt to try and do it with a regional approach. So, you know, typically most of your neighbors are going to be transitioning at the same time as you are, and you can start to do your planning. So I think that's it for me, Mac. Next slide is just thanks and any questions that people have, I'd be happy to answer. And my contact information's here if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out to me, happy to do so.
Thanks, Dave, for presenting. There are a couple questions for you. Sure. Is it a municipality at a disadvantage, or if it has its own consolidated collection facility and therefore garbage in, garbage out, which may have too many contaminants? What would you recommend?
So
again, you're not a lawyer. Yeah. Again, you're not a lawyer. Yeah.
And does that mean like a MRF? So you've got your own material processing facility?
I think what it means is that that they're concerned that if they have a MRF and there's contamination level to it, or a transfer station, they're concerned about the contamination level if they're going to collect and still run the MRF. Right. What are the penalties that they're going to face?
So we don't know that yet. I think that's going to be part of the, you know, discussions. I think the pros that you've heard from are going to have some type of a standard on contamination. I think though the basis for measuring contamination is going to change quite considerably, because a lot of the items that would be considered contamination now in MRFs with your current systems, a lot of those materials are now being added to the program. So we need to see how that translates and what that does to sort of the contamination numbers. But it is something you want to be very aware of. And during the amended Blue Box program plan process that I talked to that was unsuccessful, that was a big discussion and a big point of debate, I think, between Stewardship Ontario municipalities and ultimately the service providers, is what is the standard on contamination that's going to be expected, and how are you going to get there, and who's responsible to get there. So I think that is something you want to be aware of and you want to look at. I think it's too early to tell to say whether you're at an advantage or a disadvantage. Kind of is what it is. It's going to take education from all parties to make sure that people understand the program and are trying to put the right things there. You know, producers and pros may try and put all that responsibility on you, as if you're a contract administrator, you want to provide services to them. That's something you need to be very aware of, because I don't think you want to take on all the risk on that unless you're quite confident that you can meet whatever those thresholds are.
Okay. The next question is in regards to the municipal areas that are being excluded like arenas. You touched on the fact that if a municipality is collecting from arena today, it's, the municipality is paying 100% of the costs today to collect that. But now it's not, it may not be included in the current collection once they've transitioned. And if a municipality wanted to collect it, they may have to negotiate with the pro to still collect at that arena.
Correct. Yeah, it is. So it is something you want to be thinking about right now. I think councils need to decide if they want to continue to provide that service to those sources that aren't included, and then you need to figure out how you're going to do it. If you're going to provide the collection services and get into a commercial agreement with pros, I think that is it's a little easier. I would think it's going to need the agreement of the pros, but you probably are able to still collect that material and then just have a transparent process and methodology for how those costs would be deducted from what your compensation would be from the pro. But if you're not providing service and you're exiting, and you're going to leave that to the producers, you either will be looking to negotiate with them to provide those services and do that smaller collections to those non-eligible sources like your municipal buildings, BIAs and things like that, and figuring out how you would pay producers to perform that service. Or you're going to need to look at a separate contract or a separate way to do the service, if that's internal forces or contracted out to provide collection to some of those. So it's one of the wrinkles that's come out of this transition is, they weren't covered previously in terms of the steward obligation and the funding that you receive, but because municipalities were doing the service, it was more at your discretion to add them or not. So it is something that needs to be thought through. If you're going to exit service provision, how are you going to continue to provide those services? Or a council may make the decision that they're not going to provide those services anymore, and then they'll need to figure out how to do the recycling there. That applies more to the BIAs and small commercial, but at your own facilities like community centers, libraries, and things like that, you're going to have to look at how you'll accomplish it.
So just to be clear, they weren't included in the current system. So if
That's
we
right.
collected at the library, we collected at the arena, that was a municipal decision.
Yeah, they were deducted. So, the business improvement schools were allowed to be included if they were on a municipal route. Long-term care and seniors' homes were included in the system. But those business improvement areas, commercial areas were not part of the program, and those tonnages were to be deducted.
And we asked as a municipal, we lobbied to have them included. But the fact is that the province has made the decision not to include them and to expand the program to include them.
Correct. So the province has moved it to 100% producer responsibility. So municipalities are no longer paying the 50% or more than that, I would say, cost of the program any longer. And I think the province would also point out, we haven't seen anything yet, but at the Lindsay table, this was discussed a lot, and the decision made by Mr. Lindsay was to say, the province needs to get going on a strategy for industrial, commercial, and institutional sector generators. So the province has that on their Made in Ontario environment plan to come up with a strategy and a proposal to have blue box materials collected from those sources, but it's a future to do for them, and we haven't seen anything yet. There's supposed to be a discussion paper coming out on it on how they're going to tackle it, but they've excluded it from this, and then have said that it'll be dealt with under that IC&I sector approach.
Okay. Just two quick ones. One is that you talked about resolutions and decisions that councils have to make. Francis and others have created a whole bunch of documents that municipal staffs can use, as opposed to recreating the wheel and having a lawyer draft it at a considerable cost. So can you just remind those on the call how they access the portal to get those documents?
Yeah, so we have a waste portal that's like, you need to get an access code to that. You can contact myself and we can get that set up for you. And there's a number of reports and things available there. We are also working, Mac, on a sort of backgrounder that staff can use to help craft council reports to folks. There's a couple of good examples out that we'll share on that portal as well from a few municipalities who have already went through. So if you send an email to me to get access to that, we're happy to set you up.
Okay. And then the final question is, as a municipality, do we have to pick a pro? We've heard from 2 of them today. At the next learning morning, we'll hear from another pro, just to give them all fair an opportunity to chat. So does a municipality have to go out and say, okay, I'm going to pick A, B, or C? Is that just going to happen itself?
So it all depends on how the rules are going to be established under the under this rule-making process that's going to establish this common collection system. So we don't know yet how that's going to happen. It could be that amongst themselves, producers and their pros decide that they may divvy up the province geographically and say, this pro is going to take this area of the province, this pro takes this area of the province. They may decide to work collectively and say, we're going to share all the costs on a pro rata basis, and we'll figure out the best approach to go out and reach municipalities. If you want to provide services for collection or post-collection, you need to be talking to the producers and pros so that you can start to engage in those discussions. I think that's going to happen. You know, producers that you've heard from 2 pros today, and I imagine you'll hear from the others that there is interest in talking to municipalities about providing services. So I think there's mutual interest there if you have interest to provide those services, to connect with the pros. But in terms of picking or not, it's going to depend on how those rules get set up and how producers choose to work together to deliver the common collection system. So we don't know at this point.
Okay. And I'm sure that when we do have that information, AMO will be sending out alerts, and you've mentioned other webinars that are going to be happening. So it's an opportunity for municipal staff from across the province to keep updated and keep informed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, David, thank you very much for presenting today and being a part of our inaugural learning morning. We hope that those that were on the call for either all of it or a part of it found these sessions helpful. The FONOM board would like to seek your input on how we can improve to make these mornings better and what types of topics you'd like us to see in the future. So then I remind everyone that the next learning morning is in November, and you'll see alerts that come through your municipal staff. So again, thank you to everybody for your participation this morning. Much appreciated. And we would appreciate any feedback. Take care.